things, but we're very honored to have Ambassador Garza with us. So he is a former U.S. ambassador to Mexico, and we're very proud to say a Dedman Law alum. He also serves on the University Board of Trustees and is a distinguished alum of both the law school and of the university. He currently works as counsel in the Mexico City office of White & Case, one of the world's leading global law firms. He has decades of high-profile political, legal, and business experience and serves as a strategic counselor to CEOs, investors, and entrepreneurs. He is acknowledged as one of the top experts on U.S.-Mexico relations and on the business and political environments of both nations. As I mentioned, from 2002 to 2009, Garza was the U.S. ambassador to Mexico. And if I do my math correctly, that was 2 terms. Is that correct, Ambassador Garza?
No, it wasn't quite 2 terms. It was the last couple of years of the 43rd president's first term, and and the entirety of his second.
That's interesting. That's more than the usual stint, though, I think, for an appointee. Is that correct?
Well, it is. I think there have been a couple that have served longer. One was John Poinsett. Most of us know the poinsettia is the traditional holiday flower that's actually called the Noche Buena in Mexico City, and he brought it back to the States, named it after himself, rebranded it, and but that was in the late 1800s, early 1900s, and then I guess Roosevelt, FDR had one that was down there a bit longer. But no, I stayed a while, and in fact, I up until recently, I think I was one of a handful that still lived in Mexico up through the first week in April of this year. I was still commuting. I live and work full-time in Mexico City, and my wife's a physician here in Texas. And so we had the commuter thing going back and forth. But no, hey, first, Eric, it's good to be with you. We've talked about the work at the Rolling Center, and I've told you how important and how impactful my time at SMU was to me. And it's meant a great deal to me to be able to continue to get back as a trustee. And continue to be a small part of what I think is a great university. So I'm excited to be with you. So thank you.
Sure, and we're grateful to have you here. So I'm going to ask you a few questions, and then we want to make sure we get in time for some of our students to ask questions too. So first of all, and you mentioned a little bit of this, but just tell us what you've been up to recently. How are things going, and what's going on with you in general?
Well, in general, I think like most people, this last 6 or 7 months have been unlike any other really that we've experienced. I was listening to a commentator the other day that made the observation that from 1918 to 1964, we had the Spanish flu, the Great Depression, and the Civil Rights Movement. And essentially, we've had some variation on that in the last 6 months with the COVID-19, the economic collapse, and the Black Lives Matter movement. So I think it's been both the time for me to really focus on a couple of things, the immediate or the urgent, which are my client and board responsibilities, and perhaps taking a step back from those and realizing that we as a country and we as a nation have some larger issues that we need to be addressing. And you talk about leadership there at the Rowling Center. I think it is a moment when we reflect on the nature and character of leadership and the real need for it. But no, I've been staying busy with my client and boards. Also had a time to spend a little more reading, a little more reflecting, and in some sense, deeply appreciative of the people around me and my family. So I think, like most, it's both inventory and looking forward.
That's excellent. So could you tell us a little bit about you personally? I shared just a few really high-level facts, but tell us about you personally, kind of what your path in life has been, as well as your career.
Well, I guess if I look at the thing that probably most defines me, if you will, is home. There's that old expression, home's not just where you're from, it's who you are. And for me, that's South Texas and the border. I was born and raised in Brownsville, Texas, which is the sister city to Matamoros. And a relatively small community, and enjoyed the kind of things that people in that size community do, running back and forth between Brownsville and Matamoros, small Catholic schools, comfortably in oh, I guess you would characterize as the working class of our community. My dad had a filling station, and my mom, although she would we'd lose her to cancer when I was 13, she was very active in our lives. So I guess I had a normal sort of young life. I will say SMU got on my radar pretty early on because I was a swimmer, and my age group swimming coach had competed there as a Mustang amongst those. I guess I don't know how many, 17 or 20 national championships that we won in the 70s and early 80s, in the late 60s, 70s, and early 80s. So SMU was on my radar, but ultimately, when I left high school, I went to the University of Texas. A very thoughtful decision made based in large part by the young lady I was dating at the time was going to the University of Texas. And so I ended up there and studied finance. Later went to law school at SMU thinking I would pursue tax or the corporate stuff, and that was what had attracted me, and returned to South Texas to practice law for a number of years. And I was elected county judge in 1988 at the age of 27, the first Republican. I guess at that time, the youngest in the state, and it sort of stayed around the public arena and public service up until a decade or so ago, and now with White and Case in Mexico City.
It's really interesting. I'm going to delve into a couple of those things. So,
okay.
First of all, you said you studied finance and that you're thinking about tax here at SMU, which, as you know, is a renowned tax program. How did you find, especially maybe early in your career and now actually as an advisor, a member of boards of directors of, public companies, how did you find really the background in finance and accounting or even business law really helped you, or did it?
Well, I think it helped in a very general sense. I mean, I'd studied finance at UT in the late 70s, and then law school. And for the next 20, 25 years, I was in public service. I've been a county judge, secretary of state, chairman of the Railroad Commission there. So it gave me a framework for looking at things, as did the law. But I have no illusions as I sit on boards now. There's people that have spent their entire lives and are much deeper and have much more expertise in the financial area. I guess what it gave me was an appreciation for that expertise and enough insight to be able to kind of scratch around and ask the right questions. But no, I enjoyed the study. And when I graduated from the University of Texas, I actually was thinking about an MBA. And talking, to friends at that time, I still was not real clear on a career path. And quite frankly, I thought law would be a good course of study, and I found that it was, in many respects, more law than finance prepared me for the things I've done, because it gave me a way of looking at things, a way of analyzing things, a way of assessing a situation that I think has served me well. I'm not going to tell you that I'm a great lawyer, but I recognize great legal talent. And in the workplace, I've generally sought it out. Look for talent, surround yourself with talented people, have a clear sense of what you want to accomplish, and then hold folks accountable. And I think that's what boards do. In my role as essentially general counsel to a number of companies, I'm not actively on hands doing legal work, but I'm guiding and coordinating projects. And I think those backgrounds have served me well.
What are some things that stick out in your mind about your experience at Dedman Law and being a student, and then now being on the board of trustees for the university?
Well, Eric, I'm not gonna lie to you. I want a great student, and I'd be hard pressed to tell you whether I graduated in the bottom third or the bottom half. But I did enjoy it. The things that impressed me most to this day, I characterize C. Paul Rogers as kind of an inspirational type person. He was a very young contracts professor then, later the dean of the law school, and he's still there. And he had an accessibility, both intellectual and personally, that I thought was important, and he made a real impression. Dean Galvin, who's long gone, was my student advisor. and was accessible. I met a number of people, and I was one of a handful of Latinos there on the campus in those years. But through our then Masters of Comparative Law, there were a number of LLMs from Peru, Colombia, Mexico, some of which are friends to this day. There's a couple of Venezuelans that I stayed in contact with. And so I think the impact was not only in the classroom, where I was exposed to people like Professor Rogers, but in the environment around, where I started to get a sense of from the Masters of Comparative Law of Latin America, and just, you know, the transition from the University of Texas, which is a huge state university, to SMU, it gave you two very different worlds, both of which are very much a part of the state of Texas. So I think what it did, both at the University of Texas and SMU, was broaden my sense of what the state was about. And so I think the experience at SMU was as much the classroom as it was the community around the law school.
That's excellent. I wanted to just interject here. So we have Nellie, who tells us that she went to Progresso High School and loves Brownsville. So
oh, good.
Would want you to know that.
The Progresso Red Ants. There you go.
So just a few minutes on as you mentioned, you've served in private practice. You've been in politics, including at the highest level, the Secretary of State, Railroad Commissioner, and then on to serve at the federal level. And now as members of boards of directors and advisor, to clients through the law firm. Can you just briefly tell us a little bit about the things that have been similar through each of those experiences, as well as the different things that you've acquired as you've experienced each one of those phases? I mean, each one could be a whole career in and of itself, right? And so you've been able to experience each of those.
Well, they were all fairly distinct challenges, but they generally were in what I would characterize roughly as the executive. As a county judge in South Texas, you're the chief executive officer for a county. Secretary of State's office, the chief elections officer for the state of Texas. At the Railroad Commission, I worked with two other commissioners, so that was a bit different as a regulatory body. But I think the skill sets were different, but there were a few things that I think that are true and necessary to all. And while I try not to fall back on too many aphorisms, I've over the course of my life, I've read a little bit about leadership and read about individuals that I find aspirational in nature, that you'd want to model yourselves after. And it shouldn't surprise anybody that this native Texan would simply paraphrase Sam Houston, who said, "Do right and risk the consequences." I've expanded on that a little bit. I think regardless of what you're doing, you should do right, because integrity matters. And if you are going to be in any sort of leadership position, you're going to have to, if not inspire, at least have the respect of the people around you. And I think integrity is the single most important element of garnering respect. So mine is do right, enjoy. People are always talking about the need for passion, or the need to have a sense of what you're doing has purpose. So I think enjoying something suggests that there is a passion or a purpose to what you're doing. And then the third might sound almost sort of nonsensical, but it's repeat. The ability to do right and enjoy every single day makes doing it easier. And so throughout my positions, I've tried to bring a sense of do the right thing for the right reasons, and do it as long as you're enjoying it, and repeat that. And so I think that whether it was at the county level, the state level, or certainly in Mexico, that was sort of the aphorism, if you will, that I live by, with due attribution to Sam Houston.
That's great advice. I'd like to take some time here and ask our students if they want to pose some questions. Feel free to put those in the chat, and then I can read them to Ambassador Garza.
I So I can pull up the chat as well. Here we go. Oh, I went to
Let's see
Progresso High School.
there. So this is from Ambrosia, and she's one of our business law boot camp students. So shout out
Uh-huh.
to her. She said, which was your favorite profession of all those that you mentioned, and why?
Uh, well, if you're gonna force rate them, I'd have to say probably the county and then the ambassadorship. I enjoyed being the county judge for lots of reasons, but serving at the local level at that point in my life, there was a certain urgency to what we were doing. This was 1988. There were large stretches of the border that had no water or wastewater, so we were involved in some of those projects. So they're called colonias, these areas where the underserved areas. And I was involved in water and wastewater projects. Also involved in the delivery of healthcare services to certain areas. I served on the board of the immigrant of the indigent and migrant health center in the area. And so there was a sense of what you were doing had an impact on people's lives, and you could see them and meet them and know and sense the difference that you were making. The other is really serving as the ambassador to Mexico. When I was a baby lawyer back in 1983 through 1988, I was practicing law in South Texas. And as most lawyers at that point in their career, you're taking your court appointments and marching into federal court and doing, having to do the best you can defending people. But I always envied the U.S. attorneys because they would stand up in court and they'd say, Your Honor, on behalf of the United States of America, I. And I thought, what a cool thing to do, to be able to stand up and say, you represent the United States of America. And the closest I've ever had to that same experience was in Mexico, when I realized I quite literally was representing the United States of America abroad and trying to do everything to advocate for the interest of the U.S. interest in Mexico. So I'd say from the standpoint of satisfaction and urgency and having a real sense of the people you serve and the impact you're having on their lives, it was the county level. From a strictly personal standpoint, the pride of being able to stand up in Mexico and say, I represent the United States of America was something very, quite an honor. It was very humbling.
Along those lines, we have a question from Ruan. He said, can you tell us what a day as an ambassador is like, and how do you balance your responsibilities between, I would say, Mexican interests that relate to the United States and Washington, D.C. with the State Department?
Well, a day in the life can be just about anything. And I guess rather than try to recount a particular day and what the line by line of the schedule looked like, I will tell you that you are constantly shifting gears, because in a one-on-one meeting, you may be the lawyer for the U.S. interest, and you have to be very direct and very aggressive in your representation. Other times, you may be advocating on behalf of an entire sector of U.S. interest, let's say that have an intellectual property issue or a legal issue. There you are more like the lobbyist or the advocate to the legislatures, let's say, more broadly. Day in and day out, you're managing the U.S. brand in Mexico, how we're perceived and how we're thought of. And so your role would depend on the issue. Are you the lawyer that day? Are you the brand manager that day? Are you advocating? Are you the lobbyist for a certain sector that day? And the most critical really was the U.S. citizens' interest abroad. Or do you have somebody that needs to be airlifted out of Mexico, or somebody that has been, that is imprisoned unfairly or unjustly? And so it's a job where you're constantly shifting gears throughout the day. So I don't know that there was really a typical day. And in terms of balancing the interests, I never felt like I had to balance them, because my task or my charge was representing the U.S. interest abroad. Now, how you talk about those interests sometimes is the key, because many of our interests with Mexico are aligned, particularly in the trade and the economic. The alignment post NAFTA was very, very clear. And so a lot of times, rather than saying, by God, we need this because I've got a company in the United States that needs it, you'd say, by God, we both need this because our economic interests are so aligned that we need to be doing this a certain way. Are we need to be providing more security or having more regard for the rule of law in this context? Because we would all benefit as a North American platform when things were done a certain way. So, you know, a lot of it is just having a feel for the moment, having a deep understanding of the country and the U.S. interests abroad, and how to advocate and position them in a way that the host country, in this case Mexico, would see the alignment, would appreciate the alignment.
It's interesting. I have a question myself. So I believe you worked with Governor Bush and then President Bush throughout your career. What was that like, working with George W. Bush, and what are some of the things that you'd like to share as far as that relationship and that experience?
Well, one, it was obviously one of the great honor that I had the opportunity to work for him both as governor and as president. And really, one of the blessings in my life is to have had people that I would characterize not only as good friends but mentors, people that I had a tremendous amount of respect for. I first met then George, before he was the governor and later the president, in 1988 when I was elected county judge. I had invited his dad to be part of my swearing in as county judge, and his father could not make it, and his son George W. represented him at my swearing in. And I would say we hit it off very quickly and very immediately. He had a very good sense of the border, had an appreciation for Mexico, was very committed to the state, and had an ease about him that I found not only impressive, but attracted me to his style. I later met Laura, felt the same way, and really having had the opportunity to work for him, it really was it has been one of the great honors that I've had in my life, but really also a blessing to have had a friend and mentor like that.
That's excellent. So a couple questions about your experience, I guess as a law student, how that prepared you, but this comes from Leela. She said, what was the most influential experience you had in law school not related to the class material? And what skills would you suggest that law students be looking for to develop that cannot be learned in the classroom?
Well, I think I suggested it earlier. I think it was getting to know the Master of Comparative Law students, getting to know Carlos Eliza from Peru, or Arturo Land from Ciudad Victoria here in Mexico. It was getting to know people and getting a sense of their backgrounds, their interests. Dan Branch lived down the hall from me, and Dan's been one of the great leaders, I think, in our state, and still very actively involved on campus there with the Tower Center. If I had to say outside of the classroom, it would have been the relationships and the diversity of their backgrounds. And again, I bring back to SMU was very different from Texas, but very much a part of that entire sort of culture of Texas. And the other thing that I really appreciate about SMU was I'd say 25-30% of my law school classmates were from out of state. That was not a group of people that I had gotten to know as well at the University of Texas, and certainly not in Brownsville. So, ultimately it's the people. I think were the most impactful experiences.
So this question comes from Remington, and it's a little bit of a variation of what you just answered, but how does your perspective differ being law trained from other leaders who have not gone to law school? So, in the business world or politics or otherwise.
I guess I would say that and this is going to sound like an odd, because as law students we hate it, is that Socratic approach. Is that I think that training to sometimes asking the question to lead to the answer is more important than saying, this is what I think we should do. and it may seem like a bit far afield from the question, but I found that sometimes if I'm sitting in meetings and there's discussions and disagreement, that rather than putting my opinion on the table, or rather than saying, I think this is what we should do, you just ask the question, what if? Have we considered? Did you think? If you knew this, would you? And that Socratic approach to problem solving or to leading to solutions, I think as lawyers and people that are trained in the law, we learn to appreciate that sometimes the question is more important because it leads to the answers in a way, and it allows people to have all been part of moving towards a solution. So I would say the legal training, as it exposes you to that sort of ability to move to a resolution, would be what law did that I don't see in others.
So I've seen a couple versions of this question, and just to clarify, so I don't believe you've served in-house, but you said you were counselor to companies, and I think that means in your practice as well as on boards. Is that correct?
Mm-hmm. Correct.
So the question really is as you transition from government in particular to being an advisor to companies, either as a board member or as a consultant, what kind of background or skills have you had to employ that have been helpful to you in handling that variety of issues within a company or private sector versus government?
Well, I think, a lot of the experience in the boardroom is getting a sense of what is my, as I used to say in advertising, my unique selling proposition. What is it that I bring to this table that others might not? And how can I make that a part of the discussions? If that, will have strong finance people, or you have a former CEO, or you'll have others. What is it about my own experience that got me invited into this boardroom? Or why am I on this board? And for me, a lot of times, because of my background in government and abroad, it's been understanding political risk, understanding a foreign market, having a sense of the regulatory or political environment and how it might impact our business operations. And I think that's been what I brought to the table. But at the same time, I think when I left government, it was important for me to spend some time back in the classroom, whether it was the executive education, different universities that I've attended, or the National Association of Corporate Directors meetings. I think you're constantly educating yourself about business and about business that exists in the marketplace. You're constantly educating yourself about the marketplace as well, and what are the disruptors out there. So I think what served me well in the board initially was a good understanding of political risk, regulatory environments, and how to manage them. More broadly, I think any corporate director should be a good generalist and understand what are the macro trends, what's happening in the marketplace, what are those potential disruptors out there. And this pandemic, I think, has accelerated a lot of that. You see, the tech companies doing very well. You see the hospitality and services industry being disrupted. You realize that when we get post-pandemic, the new will not be at all like the old normal. And so I think boardrooms have to be thinking about these things.
So I want to pivot now to U.S.-Mexico relationship, and this question comes from Fadi, but he said the U.S. and Mexico have a special relationship. I believe too that isn't each country the other one's highest, I guess, trade partner, right?
Yeah.
So what can we do how does that work? I guess I would add, and then what can we do to improve, which is somewhat of a strained relationship at the moment, notwithstanding USMCA? Well,
first, I'm reluctant to characterize it as too strained. And I realize that on a political level, there's been some fairly, I would say, kind of aggressive or strident back and forths. But if you look at the level of integration, what you started with, that we are each other's respective critical trade partners and strategic alliances, and we share a border. Sure. Listen, the perennials around the U.S. and the United States-Mexico relationship will always be, trade, immigration, and security. And regardless of the moment, you're going to be talking about trade, immigration, and security. But I think that in the wake of NAFTA and USMCA, there's more of an appreciation, certainly in the private sector. If you look at USMCA, the strongest and the best advocacy for the renegotiation of the agreement came from U.S. business interests and farm interests and people in the Midwest who recognize that this integration is important to both countries. And so I think we're in a moment where the challenges are very real because of the pandemic, economic collapse, and I'll be honest with you. I think the current administration in Mexico has made some. There's been some missteps as relates to the energy opening. Opening up the energy sector. But longer term, listen, we're going to be on this border. We're going to have these issues. North America should. The Canadian, US, and Mexico platform is a very good one, a very solid one. And we're going to be competitive in the world. And things are going, production is going to move away from remote offshores or from China and other places and back to Mexico and North America. We're going to have to value and tend to and be more forward-looking about this relationship with Mexico. So while we go through these moments, Eric, where you're going to have this, and you're going to have a little bit of turbulence. I think the intermediate and long term is always going to be a fairly. I'm bullish on it.
I think cross-border trade, especially with Mexico and U.S. and Mexican, I guess domestic politics play into it, is an odd duck. I recall that NAFTA originally came, I think, forward in many ways under George Herbert Walker Bush, but then it was actually Bill Clinton who probably because of the politics of the day got it across the finish line. And then I think you became ambassador probably soon after that, right? So it was relatively new. And now we see USMC under the Trump administration with the potential of a change in administration in November. So all that is to ask, do you see that the outcome of the election being determinative either way as to the relationship with Mexico and cross-border transactions and trade?
Oh, I think around the margins, perhaps in tone and focus, there'll be some, every administration is going to bring their own sort of signature or their own tone or their own emphasis to the relationship. But I think fundamentally the relationship is driven by the private sector, by civil society, and if government has the good sense to simply establish the frameworks and then try to get out of the way, I think the relationship will continue to flourish and continue to prosper. I think the real challenge is really has less to do with the United States-Mexico relationship and what we do in the United States as it relates to immigration. And so we need to start seeing immigration and the need for reform there as part and parcel of our economic recovery. And that, to me, is very much a domestic issue. People tend to talk about immigration as though we were doing something for another country, doing something for Mexico or Central America or South America. No, when we do immigration reform, we're doing it because it's the best interest of the United States. And I think that's going to be the bigger challenge come 2021 or post-November.
It's interesting. So this is a great question from Nellie. She said, "Could you please share your morning routine?" And then, not related to that, but different question is, who was your first mentor and who was your most life-changing mentor?
Wow. Well, Nellie, and this isn't a page out of McRaven's book, but I do like to make my bed. But I will tell you that before I even get out of bed, I do like to spend a moment in reflection. And whether you want to characterize it as prayer or meditation or whatever your personal beliefs draw you to, I do think meditation is important. And I think each day we should start, particularly during these times, reminding ourselves that with the stress that people are facing, it's important to be gentle with others, to be generous, and to be grateful for everything that we have. So I think before I even get out of bed, I try to do that. My wife sees her first patient at 6:30, so most mornings we're out of bed by about 4:45 or 5, and Uh, if I'm quick to it, I'll bring her coffee and I'll have mine and perhaps go for some, a long walk at that point. And then the day typically starts around 7:30 or 8 on the phone, and she's been gone for an hour at that point. So that's the morning. And I think starting the morning that way is when you get a couple of things done before 8 o'clock that you didn't otherwise want to do, whether it's the exercise or get that email that you wish you'd gotten out the day before done. I think you start feeling pretty productive, and it has a way of carrying on through the rest of the day. So yeah, I think I would say exercise and reflection, and then try to get something that you otherwise didn't want to do done, and then get down the road to the rest of your day.
That's great. And then who was your first mentor and your most, let's say, impactful or life-changing mentor?
I don't know that you would characterize a parent as a mentor, but I will try to make a long story short. I have a younger brother who's 18 months younger than me, and when he was born, the doctor informed my mother that she had a lump in her breast. And so most of the rest of the next 10 years, she was in and out of surgery and chemo and radiation and this sorts of things. And she never lost sort of faith or enthusiasm for life. She got us involved in swim teams and took us to the art league and exposed us to libraries, and decided she was not going to die without having gone to college, and went back to school. And, would take us down to the local junior college, and then she had to commute to get her classes done. And so I would think not so much a mentor, but an inspiration for, life is something to be embraced and lived. And so I would say mom was a big inspiration in that regard. As I got a little older, I was fortunate to have Ricardo Hinojosa, who's a federal judge in McAllen. When I graduated from law school, he was sworn onto the federal bench the same day I graduated from law school, May 15th, I think it was in 1983. And he's been a tremendous mentor. Later, I met former President Bush, and I think he's been really a tremendous mentor. I've been blessed in that sense, Eric. People that either in a very real sense mentored by offering advice and guidance and counsel, or others that simply by looking to them and seeing the life they'd lived provided mentorship that they perhaps didn't realize they were providing.
That's a great point. So we have about, say, 5 more minutes for questions. So while I see if there are any other student questions, I wanted to ask you what our students or recent grads, young professionals can do to take advantages of and find opportunities for international involvement, law involvement, and also public service.
Well, that's a great question. And I will tell you that while I was at the embassy, some of the very best foreign service officers, and 2 that were actually special assistants to me, it was a competitive process and I was able to choose the special assistant, had been lawyers. One of them had been a partner in a firm in North Carolina, very young partner. She'd been practicing 7 years. She'd made partner, and she decided she wanted to join the Foreign Service, and went through the exam process as a competitive sort of process, and joined the Foreign Service, and has really had a really amazing career. And the other was very similar. She had been a young lawyer, and then had gone to work as a special assistant to CEO at one of the big cosmetics company. And then joined the Foreign Service. So I think the Foreign Service actually is something that, if you're not sure about law, or you're not sure that law is for you. I mean, I think law is a great course of study, whether you pursue it in the traditional sort of firm environment, this sort of thing. I didn't do that. I practiced law for a couple of years and got into public service. Foreign Service would be great. The commercial service at the Department of Commerce, I think, is also a great opportunity. These are both kind of competitive situations. The other is public service. I started practicing law in 1983, but if you ask me what drew me to the public arena, was my time as a board member on the Migrant and Indigent Healthcare Center. and coaching. I coached for 6 years. I coached age group basketball age group soccer and junior varsity basketball at a high school in South Texas. And I found that I enjoyed that. So public service is not always elected office. People tend to think of public service as politics. Public service is doing something for your community or for your fellow man. And the 41st president, George H.W. Bush, used to refer to public service as a noble calling. And I think that is a wonderful characterization. It is noble and it's a calling. And if you're drawn to it, you find that you derive more satisfaction from it than you probably put into it. You get more out of it. So I do think it's important. And if you're practicing law, whatever you're doing, try to carve out time for activities that are about community. And I think you'll get a great deal of satisfaction from it.
That's excellent. Thank you. Well, we're nearing the end of our time, but do you have any final thoughts you'd like to leave with us before we adjourn for the lunch hour?
And just thanks. Really, I know what you're doing. You're setting up a center there that's exciting, business law and leadership, and keep doing it. And thank you for, inviting me to be part of today's, brown bag series or whatever you're calling it, but I've enjoyed it.
Great, thank you, and thanks so much. We appreciate your service to Dedmon Law and the reputation that your service outside of the law school brings to us, as well as SMU and also to the country. So wish you well. I hope to see you in person at some point when things are healthier, and also I wish you safe travels back to Mexico when the time is right. And thanks so much for joining. Thanks to all of our students for participating. And
I'm seeing your screen. Ambrosia and Nellie, thank you all as well. They just popped up there. All right.
That's great. So thanks so much, everyone. Have a good day.
All right. Jimena, you too. Bye-bye.
Thank you.